Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Securing Sensitive Data Stored in Files in a Digital World. I'm Shay Mann and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. Joining us today is SailPoint's Chief Product Officer, Paul Truelove, and Senior Product Marketing Manager, Luis Romero. And with that, Paul, I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Shay. Let's jump in. So digital transformation is a hot topic in the enterprise today. But one of the questions I get when we start talking about digital transformation is, what does it really mean? In some ways, it's a big overloaded term, and I think providing some base definition as we get started this morning is probably a good place to start. At its broadest level, digital transformation describes how organizations use technology to improve performance, or in many cases, the reach of their businesses. It fundamentally, in most organizations, is becoming one of the highest IT priorities out there, really as we push the boundaries of existing approaches to business. Executives in all industries are using advances in digital technology, think AI and analytics, mobility, social media, embedded devices, the list really goes on, to fundamentally improve the way that their businesses operate. In some cases, it's improving existing technologies and processes, maybe using certain types of robotic process automation to, reduce the manual nature of repetitive tasks and let, a software perform, something that is fairly rudimentary. Or it could be, a way to change customer relationships by having a chatbot interact with somebody, 24/7 versus, only during business hours. Obviously, digital transformation means different things to different people and ultimately different organizations, but at the same time, there are a lot of similarities amongst companies. One thing you'll find is that the borders are becoming even more open to facilitate collaboration and workflow that extend well beyond the traditional boundaries of the enterprise. Whether it's vendors, whether it's partners, whether it's customers, we're interacting much more globally and much more openly than we have in the past. These open borders also mean that work can be done anywhere at any time, allowing for greater efficiency and hopefully greater productivity. And while digital transformation provides opportunities for innovation, it can also put stress on an organization's risk landscape. And that's really highlighted, in the world that we live in where data breaches are fundamentally a normal occurrence. 5-10 years ago when we heard about a data breach, it was somewhat surprising. Unfortunately, today, when we hear about a data breach, which we do almost every week, it's not all that exciting anymore. I think truly rarely does a week go by where we don't see something in the press about the latest data breach. In fact, I know of one that was disclosed this week, and I won't name names because I don't know who's on the phone with us this morning. And, according to several reputable sources, including the one highlighted here, almost 8 billion records were exposed in 2017. And when you think about that, those were the ones that were reported. And I shudder to think about the actual number of records that were probably compromised through breaches, not only the reported ones, but unfortunately the ones that were also not reported. But the problem is getting worse, not better. And in reality, we have to assume at this point that no company and no industry is safe. And as digital transformation rapidly changes how we think about information in the enterprise and its inherent value both to the enterprise itself, the folks that created it and own it, but it's also becoming increasingly valuable to malicious insiders and outsiders, so it shouldn't be a surprise that the number of data breaches continues a steep upward trend. And it's not just the actual breaches that we have to contend with. Our friends over at the regulatory bodies that all of our organizations are now unfortunately having to deal with on a day in and day out basis are adding new pressures. They're upping the cost of noncompliance to never before seen levels. Obviously, a hot topic that has been going on over the course of the last several years, and probably top of mind for the audience today, is GDPR, especially since it rolled out this month. And if we thought it was expensive to design and implement compliance controls, it turns out that the cost of non-compliance, especially in the advent of GDPR, is now typically 3 times more than the cost of compliance. So it's no wonder we're spending, the amount of money that we are on trying to manage this problem. At the center of all of this digital transformation, and really a lot of the data breach and regulatory environment, is the concept of identity, and in particular identity governance. And we really believe that it has to be at the center of digital transformation. If you think about it, as more and more information becomes digital, and we automate more and more business processes, so go back to the concept of robotic process automation, we have to be concerned about who has access to the critical systems and control over the processes, especially the highly technical processes within the organization. And that's where identity governance really comes into play. There are a couple things happening, though, in the world of identity that are playing into creating a more complex and a more challenging environment, especially in the face of data breaches and increasing regulatory pressure. Back in the early days of identity, we generally thought about internal user populations, our employees, maybe our contractors, but I would argue, it's only been over the last several years that organizations have gotten better at managing contractor access. So now, all of a sudden, we're going from those internal populations out to the next layer. So external business partners, whether it is your B2B customers, whether it is vendors, could even in some cases be consumers or citizens. But the access that next ring out has gained, really means we have to expand our definition of identity to include those user populations, because their access is just as critical from both a data protection perspective, but also from a regulatory compliance perspective. And now, as we're starting to really stretch the envelope and talk about robotic process automation and all of the access that the bots have to have in order to automate manual processes, it's time to change our definition of identity again. And unfortunately, with each change comes greater scale and complexity of the problems. But identities aren't the only thing, only arena that are changing in terms of the actual users. The same thing is happening on the application side. The business has fundamentally driven a dramatic increase in the number of applications and the amount of data that organizations need to manage. And these aren't only your traditional on-premises applications and platforms, but it's all of the cloud applications and platforms that are being brought up on a regular basis. Could be SaaS applications, but oftentimes it's the redeployment of an enterprise application in the cloud. And unfortunately, all of this openness means your organization, is potentially more exposed to threats, from a variety of different elements, whether it's cyber criminals or insiders. And the reality is it only takes one of those points of exposure to be compromised to cause major problems. So given this explosion of digital assets and applications, it's more imperative now than ever to track, analyze, and really understand and manage who has access to what in your organization. And you need to know that, the access that, your users have, regardless of who those users are, is appropriate for their current relationship with the organization. As we know, as users are onboarded, transition to different roles and jobs throughout their time with an organization, or in some cases, business partners kind of come and go, you have to maintain that access on an ongoing basis. You want to be able to do that efficiently and quickly, but you also want to do it securely and compliantly. And then at the end of a user's time with the organization, regardless of whether that person is an insider or potentially an outsider, you want to remove that access very, very quickly, because leaving access open is a very dangerous situation. And finally, the other big area that we're seeing really creates some challenges within the identity and access management side is access to unstructured data. I would imagine that your organization is much like all of the other ones that we see, where collaboration is an important aspect of how users get work done. And the reality is, in order to collaborate, data fundamentally is moving from structured to unstructured formats. It might be that your organization started out with a very strong SAP environment. That's where most people interacted with sensitive financial data, process data, customer information, order data, etc. And it used to be that you would run reports directly in SAP, and you would be able to route those via SAP. But now most of your users are probably extracting that information, and they're putting it in a PowerPoint presentation or Excel spreadsheet, and then they're storing that on a file server. Maybe they're using SharePoint. At the end of the day, almost 80% of an organization's sensitive data is actually stored now as files and not directly inside of the system where it may have originally been created. And as many customers that I talk to, probably find, and I would imagine you recognize this problem too, you have to think about managing access to this type of information, files and file storage systems in particular, different than you do governing access to your application and your platform systems. And so in many ways, we've as the organizations have changed, we have more users, we have more applications, now we have more files and documents. At the end of the day, all of this information has to be protected. And while each of these factors individually are a problem, when you look at them in combination, they really do create significant issues for the organization. They can result in a greater risk of data breach, but they can also result in greater risk of non-compliance. And both of those things, unfortunately, are bad. And while many organizations have started to outline controls that address primarily the application threats, most have not really started to consider what it would mean to comprehensively govern access to files and file storage systems. And so that leads us directly to one of the most influential changes happening in identity governance today, the need to manage access to all data in the enterprise, no matter where it resides. In the modern enterprise, data is one of our most precious commodities, and now it's time to change our thinking on how we should protect it. And so if we think about traditional identity governance, most identity governance programs have been focused on managing access to applications and infrastructure. The mainframe is still alive and well. We all use databases. We have a variety of business applications and maybe even mobile applications that are out in our infrastructure. And through the normal course of business, now we're starting to see more and more information being extracted from those types of systems where we have good controls, or hopefully we have good controls. And while there's still a large amount of data over there that we need to manage, the biggest problem is as it moves into the file storage environments, there's very little control or visibility to where the data resides, what is in the individual files that are out on the file storage systems, and fundamentally who has access and what are they doing with that access. And so as the engine of business continues to revolve around data, our organization's identity governance strategies must also begin to revolve around data. And so that takes us to a more modern approach to identity governance where, we really look at extending the existing identity governance processes to include all of the file storage systems and therefore all of the sensitive data stored in files. And you can apply many of the same access controls, across that boundary. The only thing you have to change is your approach. One of the differences in file storage is you have to understand where sensitive data resides. You have to understand how it's being protected, and then ultimately who has access to it. And so, when we think about it from a SailPoint perspective, we really believe that you have to bring these two worlds together. The identity is what binds them together. But at the end of the day, if you're only protecting your applications and infrastructure, you've really left a significant portion of your data at risk within the enterprise. And so a comprehensive approach really provides a complete sphere of governance across applications and files and is ready for today's digital enterprise. So the goal, as I've said, is to really gain visibility and control over all your data, no matter where it resides, and put the business in charge of governing access to all users, all applications, and all data. This will help keep your organization safe from the growing number of cyber threats, whether they come from inside or outside of the enterprise, but it also begins to really lay the foundation for digital transformation by connecting the two key objects within your system, your users and your data. And SailPoint's excited to announce many new innovations in this area with the release of Security IQ 6.0. And so to tell you more about the new release, let me hand the presentation off to Lewis.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. As Paul mentioned, I'm going to start going through our latest release of Security IQ. which for those of you that are not familiar, maybe are new to it, is our identity governance for file solution. Security itself, IQ itself, plays a key role in extending the complete SailPoint identity governance platform to data stored in files. So with Security IQ, you can discover where sensitive data resides. You can do things like apply appropriate access controls to this data and get real-time visibility into what users are doing with this data. And by bringing the governance of applications and files together under a single platform, organizations can better address both their security and compliance initiatives. We recently introduced Security IQ 6.0, which provides several new innovations that include a new architecture that supports cloud deployment for AWS and Azure, significant scalability improvements around data classification as well as permission analysis tasks, and several enhancements to our alerting and forensics capabilities. So one of the core components in this latest release is the flexibility for organizations to deploy Security IQ either in the cloud or on premises. So those of you out there that have a cloud-first strategy or simply want to take advantage of some of the cloud efficiencies out there, you can now choose to deploy either in AWS or Azure public cloud platforms. And whether you choose to run Security IQ either in the cloud or in the data centers, you can still do. You can take advantage of the same identity governance functionality. So in either deployment scenario, Security IQ can securely connect to and govern sensitive data on premises and also in the cloud. By being able to connect to all of your storage environments is especially critical to maintain strong security and compliance posture. Security IQ provides the most comprehensive support of file storage systems both on premises and in the cloud. So whether you're using things like file shares or NAS devices such as EMC or NetApp, or perhaps you're using SharePoint or Exchange or Active Directory, we have them covered. And when it comes to cloud storage, we can connect to all of the major players, including Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, and OneDrive as well. Our new connector architecture plays a crucial role in governing files within each of these repositories at scale. An adaptive connectivity model optimizes data classification and permission analysis tasks to support the largest storage environments. If we take a look at the diagram here, we have all of our storage endpoints here on the right that we have access to. As you can see here, you have some of these that are up in the cloud. Some of these that are on premises, again, the file shares, the NAS storage, the collaboration portals, and the directories as well. You can deploy multiple collectors, as you see here just to the left of the repositories. We also call them connector engines, as needed to perform large tasks. And you can also reduce the number of these connector engines when there aren't as many changes to sensitive data. And the results from these connectors are then fed back to the Security IQ gateway and then further back to the services, which again can reside in the cloud or within the data center. Again, being able to enable the flexibility to fit your particular environment. This new connector architecture enables significant performance improvement, especially with the data classification. Organizations with massive data classification tasks, typically these are at the beginning of an initial project. You might have terabytes or even petabytes of data that you have to go through and classify. Here you can spin up multiple connector engines to quickly process the data. So once the bulk of the classification is complete, you can then scale down the number of these engines to simply keep up with your daily ongoing changes to data. In the past, classifying this large volume of data also meant having to store an index that could be 20% or more the size of the data that you had to be classified, which is a significant amount. As I mentioned, with the hundreds of terabytes or the petabytes of data, you can do the math and see just the vast volume of storage that you would have to also allocate. With this new architecture, only a small static footprint is required regardless of the data volume to be classified. For those organizations that deal with complex classification needs as well, multiple file categories can now be combined into a single data classification rule. An enhanced alert management framework has also been introduced that supports alerts based on threshold triggers and provides greater identity security. These threshold triggers can be set up to alert data owners based on the amount of activity in a given period of time. So for instance, you could set up alert where if somebody was performing 1,000 activities within an hour, obviously that's not normal. That's something that is much more than would typically happen and would probably alert you to something that's going on here. Often these types of threat patterns are associated with complex threats such as ransomware, and by identifying these early on, you can take the appropriate action before it's too late. All of the alert rules can be managed within this consolidated view as we see here. We have an example of a threshold alert related to unauthorized access to GDPR data here, the second one from the top. In this GDPR rule, if there are more than 100 activities performed within a 5-minute period, an alert will be sent to the data owner. From here, the data owner can take the necessary action to deal with this risk, even go so far as to take away access of that user. A common denominator for organizations that in the past have dealt with a data breach or other cyber threat is really a lack of visibility to user activity. With many organizations also managing thousands of users or even tens or hundreds of thousands of users, and together with sometimes millions of data resources, it's a challenge to find the activities that are of real importance. With a risk-based activity forensic dashboard, you can gain better insight into how users are accessing these files while also surfacing the suspicious behavior and risks that actually matter. The dashboard also enables the ability to drill down on specific events of concern for further investigation, and again, providing stronger identity security here. So as we see here, the items in red are the ones that have the highest risk and are noted to the admin or the data owner to go ahead and take action there. As enterprises continue through their digital transformation, the number of complex policies related to regulations such as GDPR or HIPAA, industry requirements, and other corporate obligations continues to escalate. Expanded import and export capabilities can now streamline the process of migrating all of these policies from dev environments to production without the time and effort of reconfiguration across the entire organization. This import and export process also makes the transfer process from third parties that specialize in policy development much more efficient. So if you're involved in HIPAA, for instance, you can work with a partner or a third party that's able to create these policies for you, and again, it's much easier for them to transfer that over and get that distributed and configured throughout the organization without having to reproduce them. We've also incorporated other identity security enhancements in this latest release. For our box connectivity, we now provide a permissions view down to the file level. So if there are any sensitive files within a particular folder, now you can gain more granular control over who has access to these individual files. Security IQ also now enables admins and data owners to immediately remove direct permissions without the need to run a full normalization process. This is particularly helpful when permissions issues are identified and must immediately be remediated rather than waiting to go through that full normalization process. Security IQ is an important component to govern data stored in files, but organizations can gain even greater value when they implement a comprehensive identity governance program across both applications and data. With a holistic approach, you can centralize all access across applications and files, leverage identity context to make more intelligent access decisions. You'll know more information about who your users are, what their roles are, what their entitlements are, and whenever they make those requests, being able to make that smarter decision. And you're also going to be able to mitigate compliance and security risks with real-time visibility. And all of this can be done across applications and files on premises and in the cloud. And as we head into this era of digital transformation, organizations will benefit from a more comprehensive identity governance program that Paul and I have talked about here today. So I'll go ahead and wrap that up and turn it back over to Shay to open it up for questions.
Thanks, Louis. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. Friendly reminder, if you have a question, go ahead and submit that in the Q&A panel, and we'll address as many as we can in the time that we have. Okay, let's jump in. First question, So how does Security IQ integrate with Identity IQ?
Yeah, so, as part of taking a comprehensive approach to identity governance, we really see, very little, a lot of integration opportunities between the two, and really from an end user perspective want to see Identity IQ and Security IQ working in conjunction with one another, depending on the type of process that we're implementing. And so, what we would generally see from a deployment perspective, is a customer configuring their core manager access certifications, as an example, in the context of Identity IQ, and leveraging information from Security IQ around where sensitive data resides, particular access that is highly privileged, flowing through into Identity IQ so that it is displayed in the context of a manager certification, as an example. We also see the opportunity to leverage the strong foundation of identity context, the kind of 360-degree view of all access that a user has, all of their attributes and information around who the person is and what their role is with the company, to augment the visibility inside of Security IQ. So, again, our goal is to really break down the boundaries from an application perspective, and not necessarily think of them as two separate products, but think of them more as an integrated set of capabilities, depending on the use case and depending on the exact, action that an organization or control that an organization is putting in place.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, next question. Any plans on supporting more features in Exchange Office 365, like classification?
Yeah, there's actually a similar question around Titus, and so I'll just go ahead and kind of answer them together. We have core data, sensitive data discovery and data classification policies that, come out of the box, but then can be augmented in the context of Security IQ. I think what we're seeing as organizations deploy a Security IQ-based approach to governing access to files is there are also lots of other things that may be interacting with the files from a data classification perspective, especially on the end user level. A lot of the Microsoft Azure information protection services, some of the application-specific services like Office 365 or SharePoint, or something like a Titus, where we want to be able to ingest directly the classification information that has already been created versus having to recreate it in the context of Security IQ. And so our ability to do that is very configurable, and something that we will continue to extend through direct relationship and integration conversations, but we're also looking at ways that Security IQ's data classification process, especially because we have a different view of access than those other systems do, where we can actually take information that is derived directly within Security IQ and provide it out to those other systems so that they become more contextually aware about the identity, not just the data itself. So I think this is a good area where we will see lots of exploration, but definitely shows kind of a layered approach to the way that a lot of customers will ultimately deploy the technologies.
Thank you, Paul. Once a threshold has been exceeded beyond an alert, how are you able to dynamically interact with the user's session to mitigate potential further damage?
So this is referring to the new alert management framework. It is designed primarily as a detective control, and so what it's going to be able to do is identify a threshold and then monitor for activities that would violate that threshold policy. So it's a real-time alert that goes out, and it could go out to an administrator, it could go out to a data owner, but it doesn't actually interact with the user's session at the time that they trigger the threshold. And one of the reasons is the threshold may be defined on a particular folder, as an example, and so you may have multiple users coming in that are violating that session if something, a process was to begin that was multi-threaded in nature. And so what we want to be able to do is we want to very quickly raise visibility to that issue and then allow somebody to go in and begin to mitigate the risk of the threat. And so the mitigation may be an automated alert into Identity IQ to begin turning off access. It might be, for somebody to review whether the access that's happening, even though it has passed a particular threshold, is justifiable or not. So lots of different ways that we can react to that, but we're not going to actually be engaging directly in the user session to prohibit, the next activity from happening.
Got it. Does it make sense to implement Security IQ standalone, i.e. without Identity IQ?
You can certainly deploy Security IQ on its own, but as we've mentioned today, being able to get that identity context about your users, their roles, their entitlements, what they're doing. So as these end users are asking for access to particular files or folders, being able to deploy it together with Identity IQ or Identity Now, being able to get that context to make that smarter, more intelligent decision whether they should have access to that particular folder. So again, you're going to get that more comprehensive identity governance by deploying them together rather than just Security IQ on its own.
Yeah, and I would add to that, when you think about governing access comprehensively, there's not necessarily a right place to start for your enterprise. I think, many organizations have, an existing process or, program in place that is dealing with applications and infrastructure, so we'll see them start with Security IQ. Other organizations may have already deployed Identity IQ, and we're seeing them, augment that deployment with Security IQ. But for a lot of organizations, especially with GDPR, in such sharp focus right now, are actually starting with Security IQ because what they're finding is, the unstructured file environments, file storage systems, may be the place that there are fewer controls, and they really do have a risk of non-compliance and potentially a risk of data breach if they don't, very quickly move to mitigate those threats.
Okay, how does Security IQ interface with DLP products such as Semantic DLP?
Yeah, so in a similar way to what I described with something like data classification information coming in from a Titus, or other source, a lot of organizations have configured DLP to do that data classification as part of the implementation of the data leakage protection rules that a DLP solution would execute and implement. So we would import those classification policies and the results of those, in a very similar way. But I do want to reinforce that Security IQ is not a replacement for DLP. They're designed to do very, very different things. DLP is going to be, much more in line in terms of data data moving versus data at rest. And so while DLP can be used to classify information at rest, and something like Security IQ is going to be good at helping you govern access to that data at rest, DLP is really important if you're trying to prevent the movement of data into a location that maybe is off limits for your organization. For example, somebody downloading a file onto a USB drive, attaching a file to an email and trying to send that outside of the company. That's where your DLP solution is really going to come in. And again, there's not a one-size-fits-all. I think the right way to think about it is kind of, how does your organization want to layer these technologies to get maximum benefit?
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Will all Security IQ console features be replaced into a web feature in future 6X versions?
So what you're seeing over the course of the last, several releases of Security IQ is definitely a migration of, the key kind of administrative and end user features. And so, what I would say, I think is most of the major use cases when we look at, the day-to-day usage of Security IQ will ultimately be migrated to the web interface. The web UI technologies, allow us to do a lot more dashboarding, highlights, click-throughs, and I think just provide a better user experience overall. And so, you've seen a number of different things over the course of the last 3 releases, that have been migrated. There's a handful of things that kind of remain. What will not migrate, at least not in the current roadmap plans, things like connector configuration and some of the back-end administrative processes. that still need to be done by a relatively technical person. We want to get the data owners involved, and so a lot of the things that they might have used that were in the administrative console, have definitely migrated out, and you'll see a continuation, a couple remaining use cases, but the admin setup use cases, things like that, will continue to be in that console environment.
All right, thank you. Okay, that concludes our Q&A session. Keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow that will include a recording of today's presentation, along with a complimentary white paper to help you learn more about how to protect sensitive data while enabling compliance and efficiency. If you'd like to learn more, go ahead and contact us using the email or phone number on your screen and speak to an identity expert. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Paul and Lewis, thank you for your time, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.